experience we have is an emotional experience. And so he's also critical of the idea that women are emotional and men are rational. Actually, when you're having a rational feeling, that's an emotional feeling. So there's no such divide. There might be other divisions there, but that's something else again. But he's also influenced by Galileo. In fact, all of this is really as a result of the influence of Galileo. The idea that we're completely physical and machine-like. And by the way, I suspect that the impression he gave people that he thought the soul existed and rode kind of in the body was his way of trying to keep out of trouble with the church. As if he had said simply that we're completely physical and not accepted the idea that there's a soul, he would have been in deep kimchi. Well, they didn't have kimchi there, but he would have been in deep trouble with the church. And remember, you really don't want to get burned at the stake. In fact, one of the things that he was on his way to do was publish a book in agreement with Galileo's view of the solar system. And that was interesting because Galileo, of course, was already on trial, he recanted. By the way, Martin Luther never recanted on his writings, but Galileo recanted, although as he's leaving the courtroom, he said, "But it still moves," supposedly. But in any case, he was confined to his quarters, or his home, the rest of his life, which, by the way, I can understand was actually probably a benefit for him, because by then he was already blind and needed help doing everything. There's a neat book called Galileo's Daughter, which points out that even Galileo, who you would think of as wealthy, had a daughter that he had in a convent, and the convent's nuns were starving, even in such a big Italian town, Genoa, right, I believe, and the difficulty they had making sure that people had enough food because of all the economic difficulties and so on that the area went through. It's a neat book, letters from his daughter to him and back in his attempt to help the convent stay afloat. But as you recall, since we already talked a little bit about it at the very beginning of the course, Galileo argued for the heliocentric system, and Descartes was going to follow suit and write a book on that as well. And he ended up, once Galileo was punished by house arrest, he canceled publishing his book and instead published a different version later on. And in that different version, he also took a different tact entirely. Let me quick point out some things that Galileo did, right? This is opened up because of the Aristotelian nature of their science now, right? But because he's actually doing experiments, what he ends up discovering, and this is really what gets the church pissed off, because the church has totally accepted Aristotle. Now, that's part of theology now, is Aristotle's science. And along comes Galileo and points out that many of the things that Aristotle says are wrong. Experimental data literally shows that Aristotle is wrong. So introducing Aristotle, making it legal to study Aristotle, all leads eventually to this logical progress that Western Europe went through during the Middle Ages to reevaluate Aristotle once he's available, and they end up discovering that Aristotle's wrong about a lot of things. If you did see that little BBC presentation Aristotle's Lagoon, you'll notice that he points out right at the beginning that, well, here's Aristotle inventing botany, and it's such a rich, interesting book, and yet I'm a biologist and I never studied Aristotle. Why is that? Well, because essentially at this period, people rebelled against Aristotle and started concluding that he was wrong. So instead of thinking that he had solved all the world's problems, learned everything there was to know, that's wrong, actually. There's a lot of things we have to do experiments and find out what's really the case. And so you have Galileo doing mechanics. And by the way, it's confusing because we think of Sir Isaac Newton as the one inventing gravity, but yet Galileo is experimenting with so-called gravity. It just means heavy, actually. Gravitas means heavy. We're familiar with Newton and the apple, which is kind of cool. Whether it's true or not, it probably is, I don't know. But in any case, the mechanics, astronomy, scientific method, and of course that led to conflict. And the question I asked Grote, and actually in this one, I thought that Galileo had more of an impact on Hobbes. And that's the quiz question that I'm asking for today is, who did Galileo have more influence on, René Descartes or Thomas Hobbes? And actually, when we talk about Hobbes, how many folks are familiar with the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes? Okay, well, I forget the name of the author of the cartoon, but he did say that even though he's inspired by John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes for the names of his characters, they actually don't have anything to do with either of those individuals. So, yeah.
It was Bill Watterson.
Bill Watterson, thank you. I have more trouble with names than I do with, except for names like in Harry Potter, I remember all of those. Crazy. I don't know how that works. Okay, so did he influence Descartes? Well, look at all the places where he influenced Descartes. Lots of places. And here's his impact on Thomas Hobbes, who we'll do on Wednesday. Is this fun? Does this feel like it's worth discussing? Yes?
Can you repeat that quiz question? Because I couldn't find that in the lecture notes.
Okay, so I moved ahead one because I have actually a double set of notes on Aquinas. And I thought you might find something in there of interest, so I gave it to you even though I moved ahead. So the latest set is on Descartes and Hobbes, and the first quiz question is, who was more influenced by Galileo, Descartes, or Hobbes? And notice it's one of those give me questions, because basically both of them were influenced by Galileo. It's kind of my hope is that you'll see just how influential Galileo was on both of those individuals. On Descartes, primarily because of the mechanics and the idea of the body being a machine and everything being a machine. The entire world becomes a clock, essentially. They use the clock metaphor associated with Descartes' period. When we get to Hegel, we use instead the metaphor of the oak tree. So it's more of a very complex model as opposed to the idea of the mechanical clock is just here's this gear, you can take it apart, put it back together, and you know exactly how the whole thing works. And they're essentially trying to do that to the body. They were doing that to nature. If you look at the gardens around a palace like Versailles, and you see how mechanical, and a lot of the fountains and things were mechanical. They had like clock-like things going on with the pumps and so on. But even the way the bushes were carved, they weren't carved to look like Mickey Mouse or elephants. That's something that we see at of course, Disney World, but they did a lot of that, trying to control nature, trying to map it out. Yes?
Who do you think was more influenced?
Well, it's a kind of a goofy question because, how could you say? My gut instinct, though, is that Hobbes is essentially, Hobbes actually met and spent, I think, 2 weeks with Galileo. Descartes never did, although it's absolutely clear that, they're influenced in lots of ways. Both Descartes and Hobbes, their interaction is primarily with Father Mersenne. Spell his name. Marin Mersenne. So he is a philosopher in his own right, but he's Paris-based, and he's the one that writes to all these people, and in fact has kind of like group meetings at his headquarters or whatever. In fact, while Descartes was fleeing and living in the Netherlands, he moved every 6 months or so. And it makes, I'm absolutely clear why he's moving. On the one hand, he's trying to hide, so he doesn't want, the internet police to catch him. On the other hand, though, he's also buying animals and dissecting them. Maybe even humans, and dissecting them in his living room. And they don't have cleaners and things. So I'm thinking 6 months would have been just about the point where you couldn't even live in that house anymore from the smell. So of course he had to move. I bet he lost his deposit, on that, because when the owner came in and looked at what the heck he left. But so if you wanted to get in touch with Descartes, the only way was to write to Father Mersenne, and Father Mersenne would send a letter to Descartes, because he knew where he was. And you'd be able to correspond that way through Father Mersenne. And Thomas Hobbes, of course, visits Mersenne as well. So Hobbes was quite interesting that way. Let me So Hobbes met Galileo in 1636 during his European tour and was inspired by his mechanistic view of nature, where all phenomena are reducible to matter and motion. By the way, when I say it, I feel like Hobbes was more influenced, I'm not saying that's the right answer. That's just interesting. Impact. Galileo's mechanics provided Hobbes a model for explaining human behavior. So the same mechanistic model that Descartes is getting and trying to figure out how all this stuff works, Hobbes is trying to figure that out too. And he thinks that like the vein, they haven't discovered the circulation of the blood yet. What's that? Harley? Anybody remember right offhand who invented or discovered, rather, the circulation of the blood? Who did that? Harvey. $1628, right? Remember Hobbes is in the 15 something. Right? So an easy connection, by the way, with Hobbes and Descartes is Shakespeare. Because if you've studied Shakespeare, I had 2 courses in Shakespeare, tragedy and comedy, right? Or was one of them the history plays and the other play? I forget. But in any case, pissed me off though. I got an A in the first course and a B in the second course. Same teacher. I thought it was a shoe ending. B. God. In any case, so Shakespeare. Everybody knows Shakespeare. Couple nods. Okay. He's a good friend of mine. He's a contemporary of all these people. In fact, when we're talking about sources of the self, like Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is a great Canadian philosopher, and one of his big books is Sources of the Self. And in that, he's trying to figure out, okay, if you think of what we think of as ourselves as kind of a program that's been developing ever since philosophy began and incrementally gets increased, by new code, we're at DOS 6.0, we're at Windows 11, what essentially is, if you have a computer, which AC Grayling calls our neck top, right? The software that you're loading through your life and that you think of as me, thinking about me, etc., right? You think of that as software. We've been uploading the software, and at some point we have the invention of the human. And I think I mentioned once that Pope John Paul II, in his book Memory and Identity and Memory, he argues that Descartes was the one that caused this confusion with his "I think, therefore I am." Right? Well, how does that work? Following Augustine, right? I can imagine that everything I'm seeing is created by a matrix, a devil, Satan, to fool me, a demon, right? But the only thing I know absolutely for sure is that I must exist. Right? Thank you, Descartes. But where did he get the idea for that? The Pope believes it was Descartes, but Harold Bloom, who I really like, also argues that it was actually Shakespeare, and Hamlet was the setting for that. Well, I'll quit at this point, and we'll move on to Hobbes more fully. I'll still talk a little bit about Descartes, because the two of them are interrelated. They even reply to one another, and so on. Any questions? When do you think it's going to snow? My daughter says the 20th of October.
October 26th.
26th. I have car appointments, so
I was joking.
bye. I'm hoping that I get all my car appointments in before it snows. Well, tomorrow is it's Thursday. I have my Audi appointment, and I need my snow tires because I've driven that in snow before without snow tires, and it's like ice skating. It's ridiculous. All right. Hope you guys are having fun. I love this stuff. Obviously, I have no life except for playing with Grok at night, asking a goofy question. What's your name, by the way?
Benji.
Ben. Okay.
Benji.
Do you say Benji, or
Yeah.
you just emailed me yesterday and you
No.
said Ben, right?
Your
name is
I
Ben?
usually respond that like Benji is Benjamin, but yeah.
St. Paul was of the tribe of Benjamin.
Oh yeah.
It's just kind of cool. I gotta close up and get out of here. I'm breaking the law.
Thank you.
See you Wednesday. Thank you.
I sent you the questions.
Thank you very much.
It's a good read.
Which?
I was wondering why you brought it up.